Okay, we're at the top of the hour. I'll get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's RGP webinar, Roadmap to Public Readiness. I'm going to be in with just a couple of housekeeping notes. This program is being recorded and the link will be distributed in the coming days. All attendees are in listening mode. We encourage you to use chat throughout the program with any questions or comments that you have. 1 CPE credit is available today. To be eligible, please stay on for the duration of the program and complete at least 3 of the 4 polling questions that will be launched during the hour. CPE certificates will be emailed out to attendees within 2 weeks of the program. A survey will also appear as you log out of today's webinar, and we thank you in advance for any feedback you provide. So thanks again for joining. I'm super pleased to hand it over to Janis Parthun, who will begin today's program. Janis?
Great, thank you, Nicole. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Roadmap to Public Readiness webinar. Today we have here myself, Janis Parthun, and my co-presenter, Bryan Sinclair. So I'm going to provide a quick introduction and then have Bryan introduce himself as well. So to briefly introduce myself, I'm Janis Parthun, VP within RGP's Advisory and Project Services team. I lead a number of cross-functional initiatives within finance, accounting, risk, and compliance. And my focus is on finance and process technology design, risk management, and driving continuous improvement for companies. A little bit about RGP. RGP is a global consulting company serving over 2,400 clients, which includes 3/4 of the Fortune 500. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change. Now I'm going to have Bryan introduce himself.
Thanks, Janis. Pleasure to meet everyone. My name is Bryan Sinclair, and I'm currently the Vice President for Technical Accounting and the Practice Leader for our Technical Accounting team. So as part of my practice, we support our clients through whether it's any kind of adoption around a new accounting standard, whether that's been ASC 606 or the 842 lease accounting standard historically. But we've also supported a lot of our clients through major transactions such as going public, IPOs, SPACs, and of course we also support them through other types of transactions such as mergers, acquisitions, as well as divestitures, significant debt restructurings, etc. So looking forward to this, and I'll hand it back to Janis.
Great, thanks, Bryan. So just to give a little bit of background on today's agenda, I am going to provide the introduction around capital and value creation, and then Bryan will talk a little bit more about the roadmap to public readiness. And then I'll highlight a bit more in terms of a deeper dive of a client case study. And that'll be our focus for today. So with that, we have our first polling question though, before I start. Have you ever been employed in an organization or involved with a business ownership change, such as the IPO or merger acquisition within the past, or do you anticipate that in the next 6 months? So if you don't mind answering that, we'll leave that open for about 30 seconds and then see the results. Great, so we have a number of folks of you, actually majority of you here that have participated or are anticipating to participate in these activities coming up. So this is good timing then for you to participate in this webinar. So with that, I'm going to provide initially just introduction and highlight some of the background in terms of getting us up to speed before talking about the roadmap. So as business ownership changes, there are a variety of forms that may happen that impacts the finance and accounting function. And I like to just provide a quick highlight of these. And a lot of these may sound familiar to you, but I think we'll just have a quick highlight as we dive a little bit deeper. So as you can see here, IPOs and SPACs, which are typically what we hear a lot about. And with IPOs is when a company registers the stock with the US SEC and sells those shares to the public to raise additional capital. And as perhaps you may have heard more so in the latest past years is SPACs, the special purpose acquisition company, a type of company commonly known to acquire and merge with the target private company and have no business operations, but essentially a shell company or a blank check. And then mergers and acquisitions, transactions having to involve a combination of two or more companies into a single entity, or purchasing most or all the other company shares to acquire the company. And then divestiture, which could be multiple approaches, having to have a spinoff, which is the creation of the new independent company by distributing the shares of the subsidiary to the parent so that the subsidiary can become a separate independent company. Or else it could be a carve out, which is selling a minority interest in the subsidiary business unit to the outside investors. Now, I wanted to just at least highlight in terms of what was going on in 2021. And the IPOs were really at a record high as private companies were rushing to reach the soaring valuations of their publicly listed peers. And of course, technology listings remain popular with the market investors. And as you can see in terms of some of this data, we have over 450 billion that was raised, capital that was raised globally in terms of from an IPO perspective. And then approximately 145 billion in terms of special purpose acquisition companies that went public in 2021. And this data was more so up to Q4 2021, so essentially for the full year last year. Now, in terms of focusing more on IPOs and SPACs, just wanted to provide a quick comparison between the two. And here are some of the highlights, at least the main points that we tend to see or hear more often. So from a business arrangement perspective, you can see that SPACs are typically structured as a merger with the sponsor buying the private company versus having a traditional IPO, creating new shares to sell. But then when it comes to underwriting in the traditional IPO, the cost of the hiring of the investment bankers or underwriters alone can be 4 to 7% of the IPO's entire proceeds. And so from a SPAC perspective, the acquirer pays for the underwriting costs, fees, versus the IPO companies having to pay directly. And then for the right to withdraw and volatility, traditional IPOs valuations can be subject to the interest in the stock market at the moment. But then in terms of for the valuation of the private company, and a SPAC deal is typically done in private negotiations, and which may help avoid some of the ups and downs of the public market. In terms of market value, it's connected to what I just mentioned and explained earlier on the volatility. The SPAC value is dependent on the investor contribution versus where the market value of the traditional IPO will be more dependent on the market interest. And then from a timeline perspective, a merger between a SPAC and its target can be between 4 to 6 months, which a traditional IPO can take 12 to 18 months. So a timeline perspective, there is a bit of a variation. And then the last thing just wanting to highlight is the filing requirements. For filing requirements, a traditional IPO may require a Form S-1 filing, where a SPAC may require a Form S-4 filing along with a Form 8K upon closing, which is a Super 8K. But also having to keep in mind that both require similar supporting requirements, such as income statements and balance sheet, statement of cash flows, and the pro formas. But we'll touch upon this topic a little bit later in this session. Now, in terms of common challenges for finance and accounting leaders, these are just some of the common challenges we wanted to be able to highlight and explore as you're proceeding to go public. And so from an accuracy and timeliness perspective, it's having to produce the accurate financials and having to remain current on the technical accounting standards. With the value creation, it could be raising additional capital, acquiring complementary solutions or services, or just having to have general healthy dividends to be able to give out. From an enterprise risk perspective, it's having to develop and maintain internal audit functions and to provide management and audit committees with ongoing evaluations. And then efficiency and cost, optimizing the financial processes and systems to shorten the financial close timeline and cycle. Talent, having to seek and retain the resources to be able to address continued requirements and to be able to comply with their financial reporting obligations. And insight and growth, analyzing and producing the insight from significant information and data across the multiple systems. Now let's illustrate this matter in the next slide. So as a company grows, it'll go through a transformation process from establishing the foundations of the reporting and governance to creating value through risk management, optimization, and deeper insights. And within the finance function, these are really critical areas. So as you can see in terms of the description in the middle, from a financial reporting transformation perspective, it is having to establish a solid foundation of accounting policies and financial statements to the analysis and foresight of future impact with regulatory and standard changes. And then from a financial operations perspective, as you can see, the transformation is from initially structuring the budgeting and the financial close process to then being able to build the capabilities to analyze and forecast operational business activities. With risk and compliance, the transformation is having to initially first establish the corporate governance and the control design, and then transitioning over to mitigating the risk through testing and remediation and addressing the risks. For plan administration, this is having to transition from initial planning and the process design of the stock plan and the tax to the preparation and administration of these activities. Now I'm going to transition over to the next section, but before that, we have our next polling question. So the next polling question, what would you consider to be relevant to regulators when a company is preparing or filing to go public? Is it performing due diligence, preparation of the financial statements, the appropriate filings of documentation and disclosures, performing the risk assessment, or all of the above? We'll give it about 30 seconds and just see your results. Okay, great. So majority of you have stated all of the above, but I also see that there are a number of you having to emphasize the importance of preparing the financial statements and then having the appropriate filing documents and disclosures, which are all very relevant here. So with that, I am going to transition over to Bryan in terms of talking through the roadmap.
Great, thanks, Janis. So I want to start with a couple examples where there were challenges and possibly failing to develop a well-planned roadmap and following that roadmap. The first example is the case of a SPAC and the sponsor charging ahead, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, thanks. Charging ahead through a business combination in that SPAC, and really failing, in this case, the sponsor to do a proper level of due diligence. Staple Road Acquisition Company was the SPAC sponsor, and Momentous was the target. And unfortunately, in the process of filing their SEC statements, they provided some very misleading statements associated with the proposed merger and failed to provide really adequate results around the momentous in-space tests. And because the in-space tests had actually failed to demonstrate the technology, it ultimately resulted in, again, some misleading information being included in the SEC statements. In this case, as you can see there to the right, more than $8 million in fines that were levied against these companies involved in this transaction. Ultimately resulted in a revaluation of the target, reducing that valuation in half. However, the merger did proceed once the case was settled with the SEC, but also resulted in the exit of certain executives, in this case, the CEO. So again, it's a case where potentially the roadmap wasn't fully developed, and the roadmap wasn't properly followed. Next slide, please. In this case, this is more of a company that's already been public. And again, it's a roadmap around being a public company. Is not just getting to an effective registration statement and begin trading on the exchange, but it's also a matter of maintaining yourself as a public company. Here in this situation with Tandy Leather Factory, there was some failure around both reporting and internal controls, specifically related to its inventory system, providing inaccurate information. Again, end up having to restate the financial statements for 3 years, and the company was fined significantly, including for violating their certificate, their 302 certification, which is one of the requirements of the CFO and the CEO of a public company every quarter, as well as part of the annual 10K. So moving into the roadmap itself. So the very first step is really to do an assessment. Where are you at in terms of your readiness? You do need to look across all of your major functions, whether that's really, of course, most of the focus tends to be on accounting and finance, but also you want to look at your FP&A group, your ability to project and be able to tell the story, if you will, your tax group, your human resources, your IT structure, and of course your internal controls. So all those need to be evaluated to really identify gaps and challenges that may become necessary to be evaluated further, and then develop a plan to remediate those. And that really goes into the second step, and that's developing that roadmap. It's taking the findings and assessing the gaps from the readiness assessment in the first step, and prioritizing those and developing a true roadmap that will help then to guide you down the path toward becoming a public company. Again, whether that's the traditional IPO route or the SPAC route. And thirdly is executing that plan. What we have found at RGP is I think becoming more and more important. I can't imagine how we survived doing these years ago when we didn't have this necessarily. And that's really establishing a program management office. Having a program manager or project manager that can help bring together all the various players and parties involved in the process to help make sure that the plan is executed and be able to monitor it against those key milestones and track those key activities towards successful execution. Next slide, please. So in terms of the typical pre-execution and post-execution efforts, from a program management, as we just spoke about, really developing a detailed project plan that assesses not only the financial components that are required to become a public company, but it provides really that framework, that structure to ensure a timely and effective execution of that plan. It really also helps to track across the multiple parties. As I mentioned, it's not only the management and the advisors, but there's also going to be the external auditors. In case of a SPAC, you could have 2 different external auditors. and you could have bankers involved, attorneys, and so there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different activities and people involved in the process. And having that PMO, again, it helps to bring some structure and some sanity to the process. Secondly, financial reporting readiness. Preparing those financial statements that are in alignment with the PCAOB standards. Now, what we often see with working with private companies is if they have an audited financial statement, typically they're audited to what we refer to as AICPA standards or private company standards. The PCAOB has really steps it up to a higher level, if you will, of diligence. It invariably involves a greater level of audit detail. It requires a greater level of documentation around accounting policies and positions taken. It also typically involves taking a deeper look at past transactions that are covered within the financial statements. So if there was prior business combination, that will be looked at in greater detail. If there were new agreements or debt agreements or new customer contracts that were entered into, those will be evaluated at a much deeper level. So again, it's preparing those financial statements and footnotes that will be in alignment with those new or higher level PCAOB standards. And part of that, as I just mentioned, is defining all those technical accounting policies and positions and writing the necessary white papers that supports those positions. And it's also supporting ultimately the development of the S4 in the case of the SPAC, or the S1 in the case of the traditional IPO, both of those being the initial registration statements to be filed with the SEC. It's supporting the development of those, all the various schedules, cap tables, the performance schedules, and all additional disclosures that are required to support those SEC filings. Thirdly, the compliance and SOX 404 readiness. It's performing that risk assessment to really help identify what would be in scope for your particular company as part of going public, what supports the financial statements from a control and process perspective, documenting those controls, and then identifying any gaps for remediation. And then fourthly, if in many cases there's other aspects to the financial operations that are really necessary to be evaluated. The accounting for tax, for example, becoming a public company, not only are your tax disclosures now expanded, but you're also required to produce a quarterly tax provision. So it's being able to evaluate and assess the needs around the tax and supporting the financial statements. And for a lot of private companies that have stock compensation plans, so bringing to bear an equity plan administration process that then can support the company as they go public. Looking post-transaction or post-effectiveness and becoming a public company, you really want to begin looking at, and really kind of thinking even before you get to this point, but looking at how are you going to operate as a public company? Evaluating the team that can support the quarterly 10Q process, being able to support the various disclosures, the 8Ks, as necessary whenever material events are entered into. And then the various other reporting that's required by the SEC from an insider trading perspective. And then we're also, of course, just having timely close procedures, as I just mentioned, being able to produce timely financial statements on a very timely basis to be able to produce that 10K and file it timely with the SEC. Further compliance with 404 and other governance requirements. As I mentioned earlier, once you become a public company, both the CFO and CEO are required to file what we refer to as the 302 and 906 certifications, essentially certifying the financial statements that are being issued, as well as the internal controls that support those. So those now become more important once you're public. And then just the optimization of the financial reporting process, ensuring to make it more efficient. And do you have the right systems, people, and processes in place to support that? In terms of the execution of the roadmap plan, some of the questions to consider. So around financial reporting, again, do you already have financial statements that are aligned with the PCAOB standard? Again, most private companies are only preparing and or having their statements audited to an AICPA standard. Do you have the accounting policies and memos that can establish and support all of your key accounting or critical accounting policies and previous transactions? And then supporting schedules and performance and disclosures. Have they been created, and are they ready for that public filing? Are they ready to be subject to an audit and a review by the auditors? From a risk management and compliance, have you evaluated and determined the audit scope, both internal and in support of the external audit? Have you done the risk assessment to identify gaps, and have you begun remediating those gaps in internal controls? Have you begun documenting your controls and processes in either a form of the narrative or at a minimum in terms of a control matrix that again helps to manage and document your internal control processes? And have you established appropriate governance structure and an internal audit function to help support the appropriateness of the financial reporting process? Here is actually an illustrative financial reporting roadmap that this actually comes from a project that we completed last year. So in this case, we engaged with the client in February, and that's when we began what we refer to as the uplift of those financial statements to the PCAOB standard, working with the auditors to identify all the necessary scope that would be in play from financial reporting perspective, to the memos and white papers, to internal controls and other processes. In March of that year, the 8K was filed announcing that merger. Now, over the next couple of months, we began to work through the various issues, the documentation, preparing the financial statements to those PCAOB standards, working and supporting the audit of those financial statements. And then in April, the SEC issued a public statement around the treatment of certain warrants that were being issued by the SPACs. Now, up to this point, almost exclusively, SPACs that had issued warrants had treated them as equity in the financial statements of the SPAC. At that time, the SEC did a deep review and decided that there was a fair amount of inappropriate accounting and reporting of those warrants, and resulted in a substantial number of SPACs that had to go back and reevaluate and restate their financial statements and treat those warrants as a liability rather than as equity. And so this actually occurred during the process of assisting our client. And then as we got into May, we completed the pre-filing diligence and the audit was completed, and we filed the initial draft of Form S4. I think as a testament to following a good quality roadmap and project plan that we developed, we only went through 2 rounds of SEC comments, and they were able to go effective. And in July, they filed their proxy statements and they provided that to the shareholders. And in August, they closed the deal and they filed their Super 8K announcing essentially the combined companies as a single SEC filer. So in this case, this is a company, again, this is a SPAC, so it's a very accelerated process. Effectively happens inside a 6-month period. So it's much more accelerated than the IPO process. So, in terms of issues that the SEC or the SEC gets involved with both IPOs and SPACs, and the OCA consultations, and OCA stands for the SEC's Office of Chief Accountant. They're basically tasked to be the conceptual accounting leader, if you will, that provides guidance to the rest of the SEC and effectively to all public companies in a sense. So their top issue was that issue around the accounting for warrants, either as equity or as a liability. And in May of last year, 3/4 of all restatements of the financial statements were related to SPACs. and most all of them are related to the issue around warrants. And so the SEC, through the OCA consultations, referred companies to, of course, the GAAP standard under ASC 815, which provides guidance for evaluating the accounting for contract warrants and equity classification criteria, as well as the ASU 2020-01. Again, that's further guidance around liability versus equity classification. Also, the SEC's Department of Corporation Finance, or the DCF, or CorpFin. So they're the ones that are tasked with actually reviewing the S1s and S4s. And one of the things that they've really emphasized in the reviews that they noted is the importance of disclosure around financial incentives of the sponsor. In this case, for a lot of sponsors, there's redeemable shares. And what they want to make sure, again, to the extent that the disclosures in those S4 filings are very clear and broad of the incentives that the sponsor has involved in those financial incentives. So, and also how they achieve the appropriate accounting, whether it's permanent classification down in equity as a mezzanine and or as a liability. And again, they refer to guidance out there under ASC 480 and the EITF topic D98. And then finally, the division of enforcement. And so when there is anticipation that there was wrongdoing, that's where the division of enforcement gets involved. And so they'll be conducting investigation into the possible violation of federal security laws. And then it obviously could result in fines, not only of the company, but also the individuals and entities involved. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the organizational filer status. So under the current rules, public companies fall into four different filing categories effectively. And it's really kind of mostly based on their public float. That is the amount of shares that are available to the public for trading. So so you see one way to look at it is look across the bottom. Sometimes that's a little bit easier. So across the bottom kind of gives you an idea of those four different categories. So SRC stands for the smaller reporting companies, and those are the non-accelerated filers that meet not only certain other conditions and requirements, but generally have revenues that are $50 million or less. I'm sorry, yeah, 50 million, and their public float is near zero. So in this case, there's advantages to being a smaller reporting company. Namely, the biggest one is you only have to provide 2 years of income statements and cash flows. Now, moving over to non-accelerated filers, those are companies that have 75 million or less of public float and otherwise aren't required to accelerate the filing deadlines. Once you become a non-accelerated filer and you're not deemed to be a smaller reporting company, then you would be required to have 3 years of financial statements. And then the standard due dates for your 10Ks and 10Qs come into play. So 90 days for your 10K and 45 days for your 10Qs. And then you move up the ladder as your float grows to accelerated status. And then ultimately you can grow up to a large accelerated filer. And once you become going to accelerated, really that affects the timing of your Ks and Q filings. And you just have less time to file. There's an expectation by the SEC as you become a larger company that your processes and technology and people are in place to accelerate the filing process to produce complete and accurate financial statements. And then finally, there's the concept of the emerging growth company. Generally, an EGC is a new public company that has gross revenues under 1 billion in its most recent fiscal year and does meet certain other requirements. The EGCs do enjoy some benefits, and it's primarily across their first 5 years of existence. And that's included scaled back to certain, they're able to scale back certain disclosures within the financial statements and the filing themselves. And they also are exempt from the Section 404B of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is the external audit of your internal controls. So, but once an EGC company ceases to be an EGC, then they would fall under one of the other three statuses, non-accelerated or accelerated or large accelerated typically. And with that, I think there might be a polling question. Polling question number 3. What would you consider to be more challenging aspect to address when a company is preparing to go public? A comprehensive project plan. B, understanding the regulatory requirements. C, technical resources to address the accounting standards and preparation of the financial statements. D, investor and stakeholder needs, or E, all of the above. And here's our results. Nice. So about 13%, I believe it's the comprehensive project plan. No one thought about understanding the regulatory requirements. A quarter answered technical resources to address accounting standards. And then most of you indicated all the above. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Janet, back to you.
Great, thanks, Bryan. And thanks for walking through the audience with that information. So now what we'd like to do is really expand a little bit more on what Bryan had just talked about and really walk through a client case study and also utilizing the example timeline he had mentioned as well as part of that. So that is going to be the same client example. So as an introduction in the background, RGP was engaged with this particular client last year, and I like to be able to walk through the highlights here in this SPAC scenario. So in terms of the client, this is the target. This was the client who was the target, and the client collects and offers customer solutions pertaining to space, earth science-based data and analytics, along with unique data sets and insights. And their annual revenue range was around 30 to 40 million, and they had offices in 3 different continents. And the external financial auditor firm was already determined. From a SPAC sponsor perspective that was to merge with the target, it was a shell company with approximately 200 million in funding. And for this particular client, was able to have the closing occur and start trading in the New York Stock Exchange in August of 2021, along with the year end of December 2021. So that's the initial background in the scenario to be able to share with you. And then in terms of the roadmap, the public readiness roadmap, the audit firm had assessed across the major functions to identify the areas requiring design or enhancement in order to go public. And in terms of the roadmap development, RGP had stepped in to evaluate the findings to prioritize and further develop the roadmap to guide the client through the next steps. And then also the RGP's solutions team, as well as the program management office with prior public readiness experience, were engaged to execute. Now, there were a number of complexities to consider in this scenario, so I'd like to be able to at least highlight and talk through some of these. And the complexities really required an experienced team and a program management office function to collaborate across the people, the process, and the technology in order to prioritize the milestones targets successfully. I think similarly to what Bryan had mentioned earlier. So I'll first highlight these 3 areas and dive a little bit deeper. So from a people perspective, if you can imagine having to coordinate an effort between a CFO, an external auditor with legal counsel and bankers, then multiplying that by 2, it really just builds on the complexity from a people perspective. And then in terms of the process, as this was a SPAC transaction, the timeline was compressed approximately to a 6-month period prior to going public. So in essence, this was sort of a relay race where the team needed to have a strong coordination between the tasks so that documentation and the support all come together and timely for the filing submissions. Also, I want to note that during this preparation time, the SEC had issued the public statement on the treatment warrants, as Bryan had mentioned. So then the team also needed to take that into consideration to update. And then this may occur just where standards or rules update in the midst of a preparation. So as time lapses, the team also were required to refresh the financial statements once more to extend to the next period or the next quarter due to the stale date. And to explain a little bit further, the stale date is in reference to the age of the financial statements and when it becomes too old to include in the SEC requirements. So for example, in this case, with the fiscal year end at 12/31, if the last financial statements reported were for 12/31/2020, and then the financials would essentially be stale after reaching 134 days, or after May 14th, 2021 in this case. And this is where the team had to refresh the financials to incorporate information up to March or the first quarter. And then from a technology perspective, the lack of the SEC reporting system did lead to manual steps to update the support for the filing. And also, as I mentioned about the stale date, it really explained, having to explain earlier that this added time to the preparation. So this is where likely software platforms such as, if you may have heard of Workiva or DFIN, can really help increase the efficiency in the preparation effort. But in this case, there were time constraints that just did not allow for implementation just due to the various moving parts to accomplish. Now, next, I wanted to also highlight some of the technical complexities that occurred. Earlier, it was more from a business perspective, but here I wanted to highlight some of the technical topics. In terms of from a technical accounting perspective, the interim financials and the pro forma statements were unaudited previously and required evaluation. And then also from an accounting approach perspective, they were not necessarily documented and researched to align to the PCAOB standards previously. And then as you're having to transition to prepare for public readiness, there are new accounting topics that would come up and to define and implement, such as EPS or reverse recapitalization. And the equity composition in this pro forma statements, it had to be defined just due to the complexity and the nature of the arrangement between the sponsor and the target. Now, from a risk and compliance perspective, for this particular client, there were no formally documented control historically. So from a documentation perspective, there were a lot of initial development to establish this. And then also the other issue was having to understand and be able to manage the segregation of duties. The segregation of duties issues triggered really just due to the small size of the accounting team that they had. The other thing I just wanted to include and highlight was that I also want to note that the stock compensation and the tax planning are significant aspects to the roadmap. And equity composition is a key component to the total rewards in almost every private or public company, and many plans are global in nature and always impact the executive suite. And while these are key components, the topics here discussed or highlighted in detail are not going to be covered pertaining to these two, and just because due to the limited time that we have to discuss the client scenario. So with that, based on the background and the complexities that I've shared, I'd like to walk through further a little bit more detail from a timeline perspective to illustrate this. And in this client scenario, the execution of the roadmap started in mid-February, as previously illustrated with the timeline illustration that Bryan had provided, and the transactions completed in mid-August. So if you look at the top red chevron in terms of where the program management office indicated for 6 months, that is the timeline that I am referring to from mid-February through August. But then there were further activities that continued in order to meet the remaining compliance requirements, which are the bottom red chevron that had continued on after the closing of the transaction. So the initial primary focus here I like to cover is on the financial reporting needs that are required to complete the SEC required filings. And then as the activities progress, I will cover the second part as well. So from a financial reporting perspective, accounting policies, this included defining and solidifying the revenue recognition policy through revenue streams and contract reviews. From a technical accounting memo perspective, this included documenting the approach and the position to the topics such as EPS, segments, and stock compensation through research and drafting the treatment to meet the US GAAP requirements. And from a financial statement perspective, as mentioned earlier, this included efforts to create and formalize multi-year financials along with footnotes, and that would align with the PCAOB standards. And then for the S4 filing, this included the process to seek SEC approval through submission and addressing comment letters, as Bryan illustrated earlier. And as noted earlier, as time lapsed, reaching the stale date required the team to refresh the financial statements once more to extend to the next quarter. But then fortunately, in this case, the team only underwent 2 rounds of SEC comment letters, which helped really reach the anticipated target timeline of closing the transaction in August. And so as a quick recap, the merger was announced in March with some of the work starting in mid-February. The team was able to be ready to initiate the initial S4 filing to the SEC for the first round of comments by mid-May. And then keeping in mind, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for the SEC to provide the comment letter response. And then by mid-July, the third S4 filing was submitted, which is essentially 2 months later, and the client was able to submit that with all the comments addressed. And then shortly soon after, having to target the mid-August closing and having to file the Super 8K shortly after that. And so that is in terms of the end of the top chevron in terms of mid-August. Now transitioning to risk and compliance needs. So from a SOX readiness and assessment perspective, this included conducting the planning and the controls assessment. And so for planning, having the timeline and the parties and the scope defined, mapping out the project plan, the audit universe, and the methodology. And then for the controls assessment, it's having to conduct the walkthroughs, making sure that's conducted and evaluate in accordance of COSO 2013. And the risk assessment was performed along with a gap analysis and recommendations, as well as the draft of the narratives and the control matrix. In terms of the design effectiveness perspective, this included conducting and finalizing the document design. And so for the document design, this included making sure to map to the GL accounts, complete the walkthroughs, and develop the test plans. And really, essentially finalizing the narratives and the control matrix and the key controls, as well as the remediation plan, having to have that defined. And then as we step into operating effectiveness, this included conducting the operational testing and reporting the conclusion. For operational testing, testing was conducted and the key controls were evaluated, essentially completing the testing plan and documenting the test results, as well as recommendations. And then of course, finally, reporting, including the evaluation of the findings, which leads to the summary of the control deficiencies. Now, I like to elaborate a little bit further in terms of illustrating the timeline pertaining to the risk and compliance needs. So essentially after the closing of the transaction, the activities after that as well. This slide really shows more specific details on the scenario. And so to recap on the timing, from a SOX readiness and assessment perspective, this was conducted March through April. And then from a design effectiveness perspective, this was addressed between July through December 2021, which includes a large part of it, the remediation efforts. From an operating effectiveness perspective, this was conducted September through January 2021. And concurrently in this case, the corporate governance structure was established as the control design was being finalized. Now, I do want to call out that this path differs depending on the entity profile in the transaction, which triggers the filer status, as Bryan discussed a little bit earlier in our session. So in this case, the client had less than $1 billion in convertible debt in the last 3 years, had under $100 million in fiscal year revenue, and also had less than $700 million in public float. And so as a result, the conclusion was that this leading to the client as an emerging growth company and non-accelerated. And because of that, then the SOX 404B was not applicable, and which impacts the work plan that we have here in the last stage, as indicated with an asterisk here as well. And it really leads to limited test procedures only from that perspective. So this is what we wanted to highlight in terms of the client example. And we have last polling question here. Are you aware of different applicable regulatory requirements when an organization is classified as an emerging growth company or a small reporting company? So we'll give just a little bit of time here. Great, so looks like over 50% are aware of the different requirements, but about 40% are not aware. And so hopefully this was educational for you in terms of at least sharing some of that initial highlights and having to have illustrate that from a filer status perspective. It is important to have that initial understanding. So with that, I'm going to transition to provide a recap. But I think, you know, at the end of this, I'd like to be able to, and we have also talked about some of these questions that you can consider. But I think at the end of this, I'd like to also open up to have a question for Bryan here. In terms of, you know, what elements would you consider key to having a successful roadmap to go public? And Bryan, maybe just for you to share some of your thoughts from prior experience as well, in terms of with your clients.
Great, that's a great question. And again, I would point to having or setting up that program management office. I was involved taking companies public back in the 90s when I was within Big Four accounting. And many cases, most cases, there wasn't a single project plan navigating and guiding and putting structure around that. So I think to me that's one of the key elements is having that PMO and developing that detailed project plan to make sure that, again, key activities and key milestones are identified and tracked to make sure that it all comes together successfully and timely. I think in my experience leveraging that today, last several years, is it does reduce the level of effort. It reduces the amount of rework that can take place. It reduces miscommunication and misunderstanding about who's responsible for what, especially when you're involving multiple parties and advisors and accountants and attorneys and bankers. And so that can go a long way, I think, to really making a much more successful journey. It's still a very challenging journey, but a more successful one, if you will. I think the other is just in early on involving, involving advisors who are experienced in this process, and bringing their wisdom to bear, if you will. That can go a long way, and I think is a key element to developing a quality roadmap to help avoid some pitfalls and traps that can occur along the way. Thirdly, I think have an honest assessment of your current accounting and accounting documentation, especially any of that supporting any prior significant transactions. And that's where sometimes delays can occur because maybe there was a significant transaction in the past that now, because we're going public, is being looked at again by the auditors, and it requires a new valuation or a new purchase accounting, and that can take time. And so again, I think just doing a deep dive, and that's, I think, again, part of that assessment process to evaluate where your holes or your gaps and where your needs are going to be as you start the journey.
Great. Thank you, Bryan, for sharing your thoughts on that. And thank you for co-presenting with me on this. I think this wraps up our time in terms of today's webinar. Appreciate the audience attending. Hope you've learned some aspects of this, and please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or thoughts, and we'd be happy to answer. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.